The story of the two neighbors. Once upon a time there were two neighbors living in two houses, side by side, in the same village. One of these was rich, and the other one poor. The rich man, whose name was Zering, was proud, arrogant, and stingy, whilst the poor man, whose name was Chamber, was a kind-hearted man, who was generous to all as far as his means allowed. Now it happened that a pair of sparrows came and built their nest in the eaves over the doorway of the poor man's house, where, in the course of time, the young birds were hatched out. One day, before the young birds had learned to fly, the two old sparrows were away hunting for food, and one of the young ones fell out of its nest onto the poor man's doorstep, and broke its leg. Shortly after, the poor man coming into his house saw the young sparrow lying helpless on his doorstep, so he picked it up to see what was wrong, and found that its leg was broken. So he carried it into the house, and very carefully bound up its leg with a piece of thread, and then took it up to the roof, and put it back in the nest. Now this sparrow, although the poor man did not know it, was really a fairy in disguise, and later on, when it had grown up, it flew out one day and returned with its beak full of grain. The poor man was sitting in his house when the little sparrow flew in and perched on the table in front of him. It dropped the grain on the table, and after giving one or two chirps it said to the man, "This grain is in return for your kindness to me. Plant it in your garden and see what comes up," and so saying it flew away. The poor man was very much surprised at hearing the sparrow speak, and he thought to himself, "Well, this is not a very valuable present, but still it shows how grateful even a little bird can be for a kindness done to him, and anyway I will plant the grain in my garden as it directed." So he planted the grain just in front of his house, and soon forgot all about the incident. A month or two later the grain grew, and soon attained its full height, and one day the poor man, going to look at it, was astonished to find that, instead of grain, each ear of corn contained a valuable jewel. He was very much delighted at this discovery, and having collected all the jewels, he carried them away to a neighboring town, where he was able to sell them for a large sum of money, and thus found himself in a condition of great comfort and prosperity. Soon after this the rich neighbor, having observed the change which had taken place in the poor man's circumstances, came over one day in order to try and find out how Chamber had become so rich and prosperous. He carried over with him a jug of beer, and, on the pretense of conviviality, he offered his neighbor a drink, and during the course of the conversation which followed he asked Chamber to tell him the secret of his new wealth. Chamber, who was of a very unsuspicious nature, related to him the whole story of the sparrow, the grain, and the jewels, and having learnt the secret the rich man returned to his own house, pondering deeply how he could turn this story to his own advantage. Now it happened that a sparrow had hatched out her young in a nest just over his house door also. So next day he went up onto the roof, and leaning out over the parapet he picked out a young sparrow from the nest with a pair of chopsticks, and dropped it onto the ground below, where the poor little bird broke its leg. He then went down, picked up the young sparrow, bound up its leg with a piece of thread, and put it back into its nest, saying as he did so that he hoped it would remember his kindness. Sure enough, when the sparrow grew up it flew into his house one day, and perched on the table before him. It dropped some grain from its beak, and after a few preliminary chirps it said, "This grain is a present in return for your kindness to me. Plant it in your garden and see what grows up." The rich man was greatly delighted on hearing this, and thought to himself that he would soon be the possessor of beautiful jewels like his neighbor. He prepared a bed very carefully in his garden, and planted the grain in the richest part of the soil. Every day he used to go and watch the spot, carefully examining the young shoots to see how they were getting on. The seed sprouted and grew very fast, and one morning, when he went out as usual to see how his crop was doing, to his astonishment he found that instead of a few stalks of barley, as he had expected, a great fierce-looking man, with a bundle of papers under his arm, was standing in the middle of the bed. The rich man was very frightened at seeing this truculent-looking stranger, and asked who he was. "I was a creditor of yours in one of your former existences," replied the apparition. "You were then heavily in my debt, and I have come back here with all the necessary documents to claim what you owed me." So saying, the stranger seized upon the rich man's house, his cattle, his sheep, his lands, and all his possessions, and reduced the rich man to the position of a slave in his household. Some months after, Chamber, now rich and prosperous, started off on a journey, and before going he asked Zering to take charge of a bag of gold dust for him, and to keep it until he returned. Zering undertook the charge of the gold, but in his new state of poverty and dependence he was unable to resist the temptation of spending some of it, and at last he found that the whole of the gold left in his charge was exhausted. Not knowing what to do, he filled the bag with sand, and awaited his neighbor's return with some trepidation. A few days after, Chamber came back from his journey, and called upon his neighbor, and asked for his bag of gold. Zering produced the bag and handed it over to Chamber without saying anything, and when Chamber opened it to see whether the gold was all right, he found that it contained sand instead of gold. "How is this?" said he. "I entrusted to you a bag of gold dust, and you have given me back only sand." The dishonest neighbor had no reply to make. He pretended to look very surprised, and all he could say was, "My friend, it has turned into this. My friend, it has turned into this." Chamber said nothing more, but carried off the bag to his own house. Soon afterwards, Chamber announced his intention of starting a school for little boys, where they would be taught free, and Zering, thinking that a free education for his son was not to be neglected, sent over his young son to attend the school. A few days later, he found it necessary to make a short journey to a neighboring town, and before starting he entrusted his little son to his neighbor, Chamber, and asked him to look after the boy until his return. As soon as he was gone, Chamber procured a tame monkey and taught it to say the following words: "Worthy father, I am turned into this. Worthy father, I am turned into this." When Zering returned from his journey, he walked over to the schoolhouse one day to see how his son was getting on, and he found Chamber seated there teaching the boys their lessons. Zering looked round to see his son, but could not detect him anywhere, but to his surprise he noticed a monkey seated on one of the benches. "Where is my son?" asked Zering, "and how is he getting on?" Chamber said nothing, but picked up the monkey and carried it to him. "What do you mean by this?" said Zering. "This is not my son." "Where is the boy whom I entrusted to your care?" Thereupon the monkey spoke up and said, "Worthy father, I am turned into this. Worthy father, I am turned into this." The father flew into a violent rage and stormed at his neighbor, Chamber, for some time, but without producing any impression. Finally, on thinking the matter over, he decided it was better to pay up the gold he had stolen, on condition of having his proper son restored to him.